welcome to Compelling Conversations with Rabbi Akselrad. Each episode features the rabbi and his special guest discussing compelling and timely topics. I'm Ira David Sternberg, host of the podcast Talk About Las Vegas, and your moderator for this evening. Tonight's guest is Yoni Saadi. He's AIPAC's Southern Pacific Regional Synagogue Initiative Director. Yoni manages AIPAC's relationships with rabbis and congregations throughout Southern California, Arizona, Las Vegas, and Utah. Born in Israel and raised in Minnesota, he is a graduate of the University of Minnesota, where he studied political science and psychology. Yoni, welcome to Compelling Conversations.
Thank you, Ira. Thank you, Rabbi. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, you get a chance to take the temperature of the Jewish community in parts of the West. Given the challenges of aid to Israel, Iran, BDS, changes in the government of Israel, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future?
Well, that's quite a question, Ira. And, I can take it in so many ways. But the thing you should know about me is that I'm eternally an optimist. And for everything you listed and all the issues that you didn't list, there are so many reasons to have cause for concern or to be a bit of a skeptic about the future, about the Middle East, the U.S.-Israel relationship. But truly, when I assess and overview what's happening in the region and the opportunities ahead of us in the years to come, I really am optimistic about the opportunities ahead for Israel and for America and the Jewish community, for that matter. And the number one reason I would look for that to be is just Israel standing in the world. For many, many years, Israel has been a pariah. And many would still say that Israel is a pariah in the world. But for a number of wonderful happenings over the last half a decade, and most recently, specifically with the Abraham Accords, I see some tremendous opportunity with Israel being embraced, not only around the world, but within the region itself as a tech entrepreneur, a regional superpower that gives Israel opportunities both diplomatically within the region and across the world to step up and take its place as one of the leaders around the world. And for the Jewish community to embrace that here in America and elsewhere in the diaspora.
Rabbi, I think I'm going to ask you the same question. Are you optimistic or pessimistic? And you can take it from a spiritual perspective.
Listen, we are the people that is known for worrying, right? So we're always worried. We're worried about our situation, whether it's in Israel or in the diaspora. That's our nature. But as Yoni pointed out, despite the fact that there's always things that we would like improvement to happen, I, like Yoni, am optimistic about the future of Israel and its role in the world, not only because of its increasing acceptance within the region, not only because of its technological achievements, but I think that there is more and more a realization that there's a status quo that, although it's going to perhaps shift here and there, and we can get into it, that Israel is here for the long term. It's not going anywhere, and therefore its neighbors are coming to terms with that. And I won't say they're embracing it with full heart, but they're looking for opportunities that will be a win-win for each side. So I'm optimistic about the future of Israel, but it does have certain areas that if they don't address, it's definitely serious issues in Israel. One happens to be the growing Haredi population, and the other, I think they have to figure out a solution to the Palestinian conflict, because that is just going to fester and fester. So those two things in particular, I think Israel has to address.
Yoni, of all the issues that we brought up in the very beginning and that you talked about, what is the most, and I'll use the word that's tied to the title of this program, what's the most compelling for you from your perspective?
Well, I appreciate the question, Ira. I would start out, and I'm not actually going to dive into this issue, but I think it's the issue facing everyone these days and for the last year and a half, and that's the global pandemic. And I find it compelling for one specific reason, that Israel seems to be a world leader in combating the coronavirus, not only within the region in the Middle East, but around the world. but I'm going to put that aside. But I think it's important to note that just given the times that we're in. But truly the most compelling challenge, and frankly, you probably hear this all the time, and sometimes it probably sounds like it's less compelling because it's been discussed over and over and over and over again. But truly the intransigence and this challenge from Iran, this hegemonic power within the region that is taking every effort to gain more power within the region, to have this Shiite dominance throughout the Middle East, and frankly, wanting to spread that further into the world, has been increasingly a tremendous challenge for Israel, threatening Israel, not only with threats from Iran proper, but on its border from Lebanon, from Syria, and elsewhere around the region, that is now manifesting more globally. And the one challenge that we all hear about all the time is the threat of Iran's nuclear weapons capability, and that's something that is talked about in America often, and most recently right now with the Biden administration's efforts to try to bring Iran back to the negotiating table in Vienna, along with the P5+1, the superpowers around the world that negotiated the Iran deal back in 2015. So I find that to be very compelling, not only because that's an issue that has been around for the last half a decade and beyond, but it's an issue that's going to be heating up in the weeks and months ahead, as Iran just recently elected a new government that seems to be ever more hardline than it was in the past. And the Biden administration really specifically now more than ever trying to get back to the negotiating table. And for the first time, we may be seeing some scratchiness, if you will, between the new Biden administration here at home and also the new government in Israel over this one particular issue. Because for Israel, it's not let's not get a deal for a deal's sake, or let's not necessarily jump back into the deal where they recognize that there were quite a few number of faults within it, but let's do everything we can within our powers as regional powers to make sure that Iran never has the capacity for a nuclear weapons capability, and that we can address all of their malfeasances within the region, targeting Israel and other actors within the Middle East.
Rabbi, do you agree that that's the most compelling issue of all the issues that we've been introducing?
Well, the threat to Iran is an existential issue to Israel. It threatens the balance of power in the region. And if people want to argue that it's our desire for oil and a stable flow of oil in the Middle East, it certainly is a threat to that as well. And so administration after administration, I can remember this whole issue going back to the 1970s, believe it or not, when I was a student at UCLA, and they were talking about the rise of nuclear powers in Iran. And so now I think we've reached that tipping point, or very close to it, where there's going to have to either be a peaceful resolution, which seems sadly unlikely, or there's going to be military action, which is not necessarily going to be as precise as people may think it will be. The way that Iran has taken its nuclear capability and embedded it in mountainsides makes it very difficult for there to be a successful destruction akin to what happened in Iraq. But listen, I'm not in charge of Israeli armed services. They must have a plan, and they're just waiting for that go ahead to push the button, and forward we will go. But it's a very, very important issue. And ironically, it's the issue of Iran that I think fueled the Abrahamic Accords, because those countries now fear Iran more than they fear Israel. And in Israel, they see a stable democracy that maybe was an enemy, but now is a frenemy, and they can deal with it and they can have economic cooperation. But with Iran, it's not that way at all. It's fueled by a desire to dominate the region and its theology fuels and informs its political decisions. So it's very, very dangerous times.
That could be the most compelling element of all of the issues, but BDS has been in the news quite a bit the last several years. Yoni, do you see it taking a turn even more for the worse, or is there more of an understanding about why this movement is not necessarily a positive thing for people who are even thinking that they're in favor of it because they don't quite understand all of the dynamics?
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic because when you look at BDS, and it's something that has been around for a number of decades now, but really, as you mentioned, has picked up steam in the last 5 to 10 years, let's say. And BDS, for the most part, has had very minimal successes writ large. And a lot of us here at home in America, and particularly in the pro-Israel community, when we look at BDS, the first thing that comes to mind is BDS on college campuses. And it's something, interestingly, that though we think about it first, it's also something that is kind of out of sight, out of mind a lot. And it's kind of an odd dissonance there, because there's a lot of noise that's drummed up on college campuses, which ultimately, every 4 years, there's a turnover in the student body class, and BDS efforts on college campuses, for the most part, have been very muted and haven't, though they're very loud, they haven't led to much efforts. What I find to be more pernicious, frankly, are the BDS efforts happening internationally, with international boycotts, with state actors or state agency, international agencies. Think about in certain bodies within the UN, the UN Human Rights Council, to be specific, that have taken up efforts to encourage state actors or companies to blacklist Israel or Israeli companies or other companies around the world that are doing business in Israel. And for the most part, again, BDS efforts have not gone far enough to fully change the dynamic. However, if you're listening closely, it is the case that within the last decade, many people within Israel, officials within Israel, and also here in America within the pro-Israel communities, weren't really talking about BDS because they didn't want to lend it any legitimacy or credence. And that's changed. That dynamic has changed because the voices in the BDS movement have gotten louder, much louder. And with the advent of social media and the capacity to amplify these messages, rightfully or wrongfully, they're reaching far more people with these messages than they've been able to before. And what you said, Ira, specifically, unfortunately, there are far too many people that don't fully appreciate or understand what the BDS movement is at its heart and what it's trying to achieve. And also, on the same hand, don't fully appreciate or understand Israel for all its complexity and nuance. I would argue that most within the Jewish community don't fully appreciate Israel for all its complexity and nuance here in America. So, you didn't ask me to give a way to combat it, so to speak, but I will just give one recommendation, and that's education. I think the best way to fight against boycotts, divestment, and sanctioning is, yes, to invest, but mostly to educate those within our community and without our community that are ignorant, and not in a negative way, but just don't fully understand or appreciate the dynamics and the complexities in Israel. And the rabbi said it earlier, Israel is not a perfect nation by any means, but with all of the challenges and complexities within Israel, to go so far as to boycott and to try to blacklist Israel is not the answer.
Yoni, if I could, I want to engage Yoni a little bit on this BDS, because it's one of the things that I think is so troubling on so many levels. Now, there's two things that really trouble me about the boycott, divestment, sanctions. One is that there are oftentimes, as rabbis, we want to form coalition partners. You could say Black Lives Matter, for example, or the Me Too movement. And for whatever reason, instead of sticking to the particular ideology and issue that they are supporting, they throw in the BDS component, which makes it very difficult to say, hey, we're with you, and yet we want to be with you. We want to be with Black Lives Matter, perhaps, or with the Me Too, and yet then there's this anti-Israel component. And there's two philosophies amongst my colleagues. One is, well, they poisoned it, so stay away. The other is, well, let's join where we can, and then as we become part of those movements, then we'll have a say in trying to change their charters. So that's the first thing. The second thing, which we can touch upon after we talk about the first thing, is really young Jews who are becoming part of the BDS movement, and that's so disconcerting. But do you have any suggestions on strategy when they poison the apple, so to speak? It's really troubling to me.
No, I appreciate that, Rabbi, because I agree with you. It's an extremely troubling dynamic that we're running into, and I can't speak from a position of authority when it comes to clergy engaging clergy, but I can say, I hinted at it a little bit in terms of, I said broadly education, and I truly do believe education is the key to everything, because I believe, this is me speaking right now. I believe that within our society, we have an ignorance issue, and it's not, and I think it's a beautiful opportunity. When I look at issues of ignorance, far too many people are ignorant of other peoples, other societies, other cultures, religions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when you look in the mirror and you recognize that you're ignorant of something, the best opportunity is to learn about it, to educate oneself, and hopefully people around you will help educate you to learn more. And it's a collective responsibility, and not to fall into the trap of letting our ignorance as being weaponized. Now, truly, I believe when it comes to leaders in our communities, it's incumbent upon ourselves to build those relationships and to build those bridges and coalitions within our community and outside of our community. And to take opportunities to educate specifically leaders within, and force, what I like to call force multipliers within other communities, people who have the cachet, who have the influence of communities writ large, but also people around their communities in the world, and to educate them specifically when it comes to Israel, on the U.S.-Israel relationship, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. One of the things that AIPAC does is we take a great deal of effort to identify up-and-coming political leaders around the country who may or may not have aspirations for higher office, and take them to Israel, educate them on the complexities of the region and the country and the society and the conflicts between the religions there within. And they get a small glimpse of it, but it's the beginning of a conversation, the beginning of an important relationship that they're building, not just with us in the pro-Israel community, but more importantly, they're building a relationship with Israel, and nothing can replace that. And I'm not advocating, find your community leaders within Las Vegas and elsewhere and take them to Israel and educate them. But in any capacity that we can embrace those outside of our community, but also those within our community. And it gets to your second question about the younger generation within the Jewish community, and help them build a positive relationship with Israel, with all the nuance and complexities there within, and have that as the basis with which you can build further learning and opportunities to grow together. And I think only positive outcomes will come after.
No, I agree with you, but it's a little bit, I agree that education is the answer, but maybe it's not the answer. Maybe it's a answer. It's got to be on so many different levels. But, for my generation, we were dominated by the theology of the Holocaust in Israel. Israel was this great miracle. My parents, myself, my family, very pro-Israel. Israel was this, small country being surrounded by millions who wanted to destroy her, and yet she survived. And that whole narrative post-Shoah was so important to our identity. You could be a non-religious Jew, but you'd be this cultural Jew who was supportive of Israel, and that would be your passion for being Jewish. But the young people, it's not working for them. The Holocaust is too far away, and Israel is not necessarily the Jewish Disneyland that they've been taught. And so I think we do a little bit of a disservice when we don't share some of the warts to Israel, but at the same time, paint a portrait of the positives. I've also thought that perhaps Birthright, an incredible program, is perhaps almost already too late. And that when I was a kid, I went to Israel in my teens, and a lot of those programs have been hurt because of Birthright, because parents will say, well, if you wait a couple more years, you can go for free on Birthright. So they don't want to invest the money on a teen program. And I'm speaking to any philanthropist who's listening, that perhaps more money needs to be invested in encouraging these teen programs so that the teens can come back as ambassadors and really be prepared when they enter college to fight for pro-Israel issues. You can't substitute the experience of actually being in Israel, no matter what your age.
Here's what I see as a problem, and I'd like both of you to address it. Yoni talked about fighting this with education, and the rabbi talked about it as well. But can you fight propaganda with education? Because propaganda, skillfully applied, as we've seen for centuries, can work wonders in a negative way. So is education by itself, or as the rabbi talked about, such things as going to Israel, and how do you deal with the current generation and succeeding generation? So I guess that's what I would like to open up to both of you, is how do you combat propaganda besides using education, which is an ideal way to combat propaganda, but it's not the only way to combat propaganda.
Boy, Ira, that's a tough one, because you're right. And I was hinting at this a little bit earlier, but particularly with propaganda, you see it weaponized in such a way on social media now, where it reaches tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And before, whether the propaganda has elements of truth to it or not, or completely, as we like to call it these days, fake news, before you have the opportunity to even push back against it, it's reached the masses, and the message is there, and it's embedded within people's minds, and you're not going back. So it is a tough one. Yes, I think education is an opportunity. And if I could just paint the picture, we saw this happen. If you go back to May of this year, in the most recent conflict between Israel and Gaza, when tens and tens and tens of thousands of rockets were lobbed from Gaza into Israel. And the inciting reason why Gaza, the Hamas in the Gaza Strip decided to start attacking Israel and threatened Israel was because of a fake clip that was circulated on Twitter about Israelis and Israel storming the Temple Mount and burning it down. And what in truth, what was taking place was that there happened to be some Palestinians on the top of the Temple Mount that were shooting firecrackers down at Jews down below who were praying at the Temple Mount. Excuse me, not the Temple Mount, but at the Western Wall. And one of the firecrackers hit a tree and set it ablaze. And the clip that was going viral on every single social media platform was Israelis dancing and singing, and they were there because it was the celebration of Jerusalem Reunification Day, while there was this image of the Temple Mount burning in the background. But those images, those videos, those messages get spread, no pun intended, like wildfire, before the opportunity to truly explain what's happening and the context can truly bleed through. So I share that to kind of exemplify the challenge there within. But no, education alone, I don't think is the only way. I think we have to be able to fight back with the truth. And in many respects, AIPAC's efforts are to appeal to our leaders. I was saying earlier, engaging force multipliers. AIPAC, in every respect, we do that with our elected officials in Washington, D.C., but also engaging community leaders across the country to get them to speak out and to speak out the truth. I think that helps push back against these narratives. And unfortunately, right now, we're not at a place as an American pro-Israel community where our reach is as far or frankly, as viral, if you will, as some of those pernicious actors who are propagating on the other side. I also think that we have to find the positive stories that are happening both in Israel and also here in America, and get those remarkable stories in front of people. And we were talking a little bit, just with your last question, Ira, Rabbi was talking about engaging faith leaders for coalition building. There was a remarkable story that came out in the Times of Israel yesterday about an effort that was organized between a pastor in the south side of Chicago and an Israeli organization called Natal, that works in doing therapy with trauma victims of terror in Israel. And they have trained over the course of the last 5 years staff people from this organization in the south side of Chicago, multiple efforts over the last 5 years or so, learning techniques so that they can give the proper therapy and the needs to people that are dealing with trauma from violence, particularly gang and gun violence on the south side of Chicago. And this is an effort that, frankly, no one knows about, but was just recently discussed in the Times of Israel. And it highlights a remarkable example of outside of the realm of defense and diplomacy, the things that we know exist between the US and Israel, but ways that Israeli organizations are helping on the ground in traumatized communities here in America. And there are far many more examples, but those are the stories that we should be sharing, but also encouraging, boots on the ground, encouraging more of these efforts, because, well, as more and more communities are exposed to the positivity and the help and the ingenuity that Israel can provide in so many different realms, individuals are going to recognize that when this propaganda is out there, that it's kind of nonsense, and that the Israel that they know is something that's much more positive in their heart.
Yoni, you should know that in Las Vegas, the trauma unit from Israel came out to Las Vegas also after 1 October, after the mass shooting at the Harvest Festival. So they've been out here too, and I participated in some of that training. So you're right, there are a lot of positive stories. But what gets me, you were talking about the recent conflict between Israel and Gaza. Every time there's a conflict, it's the same exact argument. They'll say Israel is attacking civilian populations, and Israel will say that they're hiding the weapons, in schools and in mosques. And so what choice do we have? And Israel has a free press, so the press goes in there and the Palestinians don't. And so the narrative is spun every single time in the exact same ways, in a negative light towards Israel. And you would think, knowing this, because it's happened again and again and again, that there would be almost like a preparation on Israel's part, or the pro-Israel community that would be ready to inform the public of not the distances and how small they are, the importance of Iron Dome and what it really does, not only to protect Israeli citizens, but ironically, it protects the Palestinians. We almost lost funding for Iron Dome, and it's purely defensive, but without Iron Dome, for example, Israel would have no choice but to launch an immediate ground offensive, which would be very costly to the Palestinian people. Now, this protects Israel's population, gives Israel time to reflect and to decide what they should do. And in that way, it provides protection for the Palestinians. And yet, thousands of rockets are going to Israel, and because more Israelis are not killed, they're saying it's a lopsided war. And it's really, really not. And yet we're not doing a good job getting our message out. And you mentioned social media, and that's a challenge not only with respect to Israel. People go in their own lane. So they hear the news that they want to hear, and somehow we have to get people to listen to stories from sources that maybe they wouldn't normally listen to. And that way they could hear the truth. So education is a great word, but if someone doesn't want to be educated, won't open up the textbook, won't watch the movie, won't watch the TV show, we can't get to their ears, and then we can't get to their hearts. So I think there's got to be some strategy on how we get the message out as well, beyond what we've been doing, because it's not working well enough.
Something the rabbi said, I think, will be a great way to end this, and that is, you can, if they're not going to read the book, if they're not going to open the book to read it, if they're not going to watch something, it comes to not just the fact that we're all seem to be in silos, but it also comes into what's in someone's heart. So if you are in your heart anti-Israel or anti-Semitic, you can present education, you can present facts, and yet, and these include people that are in Congress right now, you can show them all of this, and yet if in their heart they are, for whatever reason, anti-Semitic or anti-Israel or both, it doesn't seem to change. I want to end this by giving both of you an opportunity to address that issue of what happens when you're dealing with what's in the heart. And we've had previous guests that have changed what's in their heart on Compelling Conversations, but I'd like to kind of get the broader look at that from first Yoni and then the rabbi.
Boy, you strike to the core of it there, Ira, because at the end of the day, what's in someone's heart is going to really truly guide them. And it's going to also give them recognition of whether or not they're willing to kind of reach outside of their preconceived notions of whether it's Israel or whatever the issue may be, and be willing to engage elsewhere. But the truth is, it's very difficult, if almost impossible, to try to engage folks who have it in their heart that they're absolutely oppositional to you and to what you believe in. And frankly, I would argue that there are far more people in our country, let's just say, within the Jewish community specifically, but even outside of the Jewish community, that don't know where their hearts are. That there are so many people with whom we need to be engaging as a pro-Israel community, as a Jewish community that cares about Israel with our hearts, that there are far too many people that we need to be engaging that haven't been engaged at all and haven't made up their minds or frankly their hearts one way or another where they stand on these issues. And we as a collective community need to be doing a better job engaging those people, because there are those folks, and Ira, you alluded to some of them within the halls of Congress in Washington, D.C., and there are some of them, but they represent a very small minority within the broader population of our elected leaders that truly in their hearts care a great deal about Israel and want to see a strong U.S.'s relationship, not only now, but for their children, their grandchildren's generations, and so on and so forth. And it's up to us, and frankly, AIPAC's efforts right now, what we're doing is ensuring that our elected leaders will continue to be there a generation from now, multiple generations from now. And a core part of that, as I alluded to earlier, is educating them on Israel early, taking them to Israel, helping them build relationships with not only the pro-Israel community, not only with the Jewish community, but with Israel in and of itself, so that in their heart, they have that relationship at its core that they can build upon. But we need to also be doing a better job within just our own Jewish community of engaging our friends, our family members, our colleagues, our community members about Israel, because I found, and this was the case when I was living in Minnesota and in Northern California, and now even in my short stint so far in Southern California, that, and you can see this elsewhere around the country, there's a little bit of a hesitancy to talk about Israel, to engage in Israel, for all of the conflicting reasons that we've discussed and many more that we haven't discussed. People are apprehensive to engage on it because, frankly, I think it's out of a place of fear. It's easier, it's more comfortable not to engage. So ultimately, I would say this: let's step a little bit outside of our comfort zone and start engaging other people who aren't quite there yet, or haven't yet made up their minds, or their hearts aren't guiding them in one way or another on this topic. And let's embrace them. And together, hopefully, we will only strengthen our Jewish community's connection to Israel and the pro-Israel community here in America together.
Rabbi?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Yoni for coming on our program, and Ira for you as moderator as well. It's such an important topic for me. Yoni, thank you for articulating so many things. We're in agreement, I'd say 99% of everything that you've talked about. So it's always a pleasure to have you on the show and work with you outside the show. One of the things that struck me is, I've given sermons that anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism. Theodor Herzl's original vision was that because there was anti-Semitism in the world, if all the Jews made their way to their ancestral homeland, the world would stop picking on us and leave us alone. And of course, that part of his vision did not happen. But at the same time, we have to be careful not to weaponize people who are critical of Israel in a legitimate form. Israel's not a perfect country. And so there are going to be times when American leaders who are not Israeli leaders are going to differ with the Israeli government. We're gonna fight for what we think's right. They're going to fight for what they think is right. But I think that we do ourselves a disservice when support for Israel is weaponized and becomes a severe litmus test. In addition to that, it's so important, I think, that Israel is a nonpartisan issue. And the danger of weaponizing support for Israel is that we say one party is more supportive of Israel than the other. And the truth is, Israel has been for decades a nonpartisan issue, and we need to keep it that way in order to maintain the support of Israel, no matter whether it's a Republican or a Democrat who's in power. Lastly, I would say that someone who is truly anti-Semitic, probably not going to make much leeway. But those who are, for example, maybe against foreign aid, we have some good arguments there. Those who think, Israel is an apartheid nation, ill-informed, misinformed, perhaps there's some leeway there. Perhaps it's coming from an anti-Semitic point of view, but perhaps it's just a term that they bandy about and they really haven't thought long and hard about what it means when you say Israel's an apartheid nation, because it is a disservice to the historicity of what happened in South Africa, and it doesn't reflect the reality of what's going on in Israel and how the Palestinians are actually treated. So until we get through some of this mud and this muck, we really are not going to have healthy discussions. Rather, we're going to have name calling and finger pointing. And that's not going to lead to a peaceful resolution in any case. I have to believe in my heart of hearts that many, perhaps the majority of Palestinians want what everybody wants. They want to raise their kids in peace. They want to have a house and shelter and security. They want medical care, and they want to live their lives and be well. And unfortunately, given the current leadership and the Palestinians and the ongoing conflict, there's a lot of challenges that lie ahead. And so we have to get beyond those. We have to look for solutions, and we have to make sure that the support for Israel is there so that Israel will have the courage and the support to make bold decisions that will lead to peace when they have a partner that truly wants peace as well. So to all of our listeners, I hope that you found some things to think about today, and that you will continue to look forward to our programs. I think our next program is going to be in December. I don't recall the date offhand, but we're looking forward to joining you every couple months or so for what we hope will be ongoing, compelling conversations.
Yes, and thank you, Rabbi, and also thank you again, Yoni Saadi. He is AIPAC's Southern Pacific Regional Synagogue Initiative Director. Thank you to both, and we'll see you next time on Compelling Conversations.